All right, Mr. Elliott.
Thanks, sir. Would call Kevin O'Donnell to the stand, Mr. Chairman. Mr. O'Donnell, would you please state and spell your name for the record?
Yes, I'm Kevin W. O'Donnell. Last name is spelled capital O apostrophe capital D-O-N-N-E-L-L.
And Mr. O'Donnell, are you employed? And if so, tell the Commission a little bit about the terms of your employment.
I'm president of Nova Energy Consultants out of Cary, North Carolina.
And Mr. O'Donnell, have you testified before this Commission before?
Yes, I have.
Did you cause to be prepared and pre-filed with this Commission 14 pages of direct testimony?
Yes.
Have you had a chance to review your testimony prior to your appearance here this afternoon?
Yes.
Do you have any corrections or changes to your direct testimony?
No, I do not.
If I ask you those same questions this afternoon, would your answers be the same?
Yes.
Mr. Chair, I'd move the pre-filed direct testimony of Mr. O'Donnell into the record.
Mr. O'Donnell's pre-filed direct testimony will be entered into the record as though given orally from the stand.
Thank you, sir. And Mr. O'Donnell, appended to your direct testimony, do you have an appendix setting out some of your background and bona fides?
Yes, I do.
Have you had a chance to review that prior to this afternoon?
Yes.
Any changes or corrections to that?
No, sir.
Mr. Chair, I'd move the appendix to the pre-filed direct testimony into the record at this time.
Okay, we will enter the appendix, as exhibit number 99.
Thank you, sir. And Mr. O'Donnell, did you cause to be prepared and pre-filed with this Commission 11 pages of rebuttal testimony?
Yes, I did.
Have you had a chance to review the rebuttal testimony this afternoon?
Yes, I did.
Do you have any changes or corrections to your rebuttal testimony?
No.
If I ask you those same questions this afternoon, would your answers be the same?
Yes.
Mr. Chair, I'd move the pre-filed rebuttal testimony of Mr. O'Donnell into the record.
Mr. O'Donnell's pre-filed rebuttal testimony will be entered into the record as though given orally from the stand.
Thank you, sir. And last, Mr. O'Donnell, did you cause to be prepared and pre-filed 9 pages of surrebuttal testimony?
Yes, I did.
Have you had a chance to review that testimony prior to your appearance today?
Yes.
Do you have any changes or corrections to your surrebuttal testimony?
No.
If I ask you those same questions today, would your answers be the same?
Yes.
Mr. Chair, I'd move the surrebuttal testimony of Mr. O'Donnell into the record at this time.
Mr. O'Donnell's pre-filed surrebuttal testimony will be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
Mr. O'Donnell, have you prepared a summary of your direct rebuttal and surrebuttal testimonies?
Yes, I have.
Would you please give it to the Commission at this time?
Yes. First, let me say good evening or good afternoon, Commissioners. It's good to be back here in Columbia. The purpose of my testimony in this proceeding is to present my findings to the Commission in regard to the testimony of company witness Ellen Lapson, as well as to discuss my understanding of the ORS position. Ms. Lapson filed her initial testimony on December 7, 2017, in which she provides a dire warning to this Commission of the future of South Carolina Electric and Gas, SCEG, if the utility is not allowed the rate recovery sought in its filing. Her testimony in this regard is incomplete. In my direct testimony, I show that SCEG has tools available that can mitigate credit concerns. Specifically, I show that while SCANA, which is the parent company of SCEG, did cut its dividend, it did not eliminate its dividend. In fact, SCANA continues to pay a $70 million annual dividend to its stockholders. In addition, SCANA owns Public Service North Carolina, PSNC, which, according to press reports, has a valuation of $2.2 billion. Such a valuation is, ironically, equivalent to the net abandonment costs cited to this Commission, or abandonment costs SCANA cited to this Commission in a presentation it made on August 1, 2017. Possible elimination of its dividend as well as a potential sale of PSNC provides options to the company to deal with credit issues. Indeed, on July 2, 2018, Moody's affirmed the credit rating of SCANA and said the situation post-dividend cut was, quote, manageable. In my direct testimony, I calculated the cost of the credit downgrade of SCEG that occurred earlier this year. In performing this analysis, I examined future transmission, distribution, and generation costs that would be incurred by the company over the next 30 years. My analysis concluded that the cost to consumers from this debt downgrade will be approximately $3.67 million over the next 30 years. This higher cost of debt pales in comparison to the $445 million in higher revenue requirements now in debate before this Commission. In her rebuttal testimony, Ms. Lapson contends the options I cited in my direct testimony, elimination of the dividend and sale of PSNC, will not improve the credit quality of SCEG. However, in my rebuttal testimony, I presented the July 23, 2018 report of SCEG that conflicts with this statement from Ms. Lapson. In regard to the ORS's position, I do not believe the relief recommended by the ORS in this proceeding is authorized by law. My review of the Baseload Review Act, BLRA, shows that for rate recovery to be allowed, a utility must have completed or be in the process of constructing a baseload generating facility. In addition, as demonstrated in my rebuttal testimony, SCEG was not in compliance with the order number 2016-794, which is the most recent BLRA order, when it filed its case in this proceeding. The company knew as early as March 2015 that the construction of the Summer nuclear plant was out of compliance with the BLRA, which charged ahead to build the plants, only to abandon construction August 1, 2017. SCANA executives were negligent in not recognizing the statutes and moving forward with construction. Ratepayers should not be required to pay any of the nuclear abandonment costs as requested by the company to bail out SCANA's executives. This completes my summary.
Thank you, Mr. O'Donnell. Mr. Chairman, Mr. O'Donnell is available to the parties for cross-examination or questions from this commission.
Thank you. Mr. Gile.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. O'Donnell, thank you for your testimony. I have no questions.
ORS.
Good afternoon, Mr. O'Donnell.
Good afternoon.
Can I ask you, are you familiar with what is referred to as a most favored nations clause that is used frequently in utility rate cases?
Yes, and it's used frequently in wholesale agreements as well, as I've done a number of wholesale power contracts, and we always seek to get MFNs in place.
Are you aware that one was executed in the state of North Carolina and is included in the North Carolina Public Service Commission's order approving the merger of Dominion and SCANA's North Carolina subsidiary, PSNC?
I'm aware of that.
Okay. Could you explain just a little bit for the Commission what a most favored nation status clause is?
Yeah, it's basically an agreement by the parties that in essence says that if the utility gives a better deal to another party, then they get that same deal as well. So in my workings with a number of municipal clients, I always like to see MFNs, because if I settle on an agreement and then I find out later on that another municipality or cooperative or somebody else got a better deal, then it disadvantages my clients. So we always try to get those types of agreements in place to basically level the playing field.
And would you recommend, or do you believe that an order of this commission should include a similar clause, an MFN clause?
Yes.
Are you aware of any other suitors or potential bidders to purchase SCANA, or are you familiar with anybody that might be out there besides Dominion?
Yes. I am aware that NextEra was interested in PSNC. I'm read in the press about NextEra and Santee Cooper. I know that NextEra is here, but I would think that there would probably be others as well.
Who else would that probably fall into that?
I would be very, very surprised if Duke wasn't interested as well. I mean, Duke's service territory is here in South Carolina. They just paid a very high price for Piedmont natural gas 2 years ago. it's hard for me to believe that they would not be interested in SCANA.
Thank you, Mr. O'Donnell. No further questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Other parties? Company?
Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission, Mr. O'Donnell, my name is Mitchell Willoughby, and I represent SC in this proceeding. Got just a few questions, Mr. O'Donnell. There are a few things, I think, Mr. O'Donnell, that we agree upon, and I want to go through those first. In general, wouldn't it be true that credit ratings are important to a utility's ability to raise capital and the cost that the utility will be required to pay for that capital? Is that correct?
Yes.
And we would also agree with that the lower the credit ratings of a utility, the higher the cost the utility will be required to pay for capital, correct?
With the caveat that ultimately customers are paying that, and I think I cited in my testimony a table of what the downgrade that's already occurred is going to cost customers in that case.
Certainly. The point is there'll be a higher cost of capital, and ultimately that cost of capital will be passed through to customers, correct?
In a regulated market, yes.
And if I could get you to turn to page 10 of your direct testimony, lines 13 and 14, I think you acknowledge that general principle, and I have it on the board here to Mr. O'Donnell, is a downgrade. You acknowledge the correlation between downgrades and the cost of capital by stating a downgrade in the SCNG credit rating will not only impact the company's cost of debt, but it will also impact its cost of equity, correct?
That's correct, and I think it already has.
And I agree with you that, and the company agrees with you that it has. And in general terms, a concept that's included in the sentence that I just read is that the cost of equity in general will be greater than the cost of debt that the company will have to pay, correct?
I would agree with that, but again, I'd go back to the point that the reason this is in here in my testimony is because customers are paying for that. So the market will bid down your stock, and the corollary there is that your return on equity would increase, but customers are paying for that. And indeed, your downgrade earlier this year could very well result in a slightly higher cost of equity that customers have to pay.
Correct, and I agree with you on that point. The point is the cost of equity is higher than the cost of debt, and ultimately the customers are going to pay an increase in the cost of capital for debt and an increase in cost of capital for equity, correct?
That is true, but again, we got to put everything in perspective. Why did the downgrade occur? What caused the downgrade to occur? All those items, and what I've been consistent on in my entire career is that you can't just in a vacuum say higher cost of debt, higher cost of equity. You have to go back and understand, well, what caused it? And do your analysis and say, well, should the utility get a higher return on equity when indeed their actions led to the higher cost of equity? That would not be fair to consumers in order to have to pay a higher financing cost because the company's executives did something that they shouldn't have.
Well, let's, and I understand your answer, but the fact is the company will wind up paying increased cost of both equity capital and debt capital when its credit ratings are substantially impaired, correct?
I don't mean to argue with you, but I think ultimately what you're talking about is actions by the company are leading to consumers to pay those higher costs.
But would you agree with me that there will be higher costs to be paid?
Executive actions are going to lead to higher costs to be paid by consumers, yes.
So now let's look as well on page 6 and 7 of your direct testimony. Do you have that available to you?
Yes, I do.
And I'm going to show it on the board too. It's on the very bottom of page 6 and it extends over to page 70. And you at the very end, you're quoting from a credit rating report of Moody's. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And the sentence I want to read to you, and you make sure I read it correctly, it's on line 34, carries over to line 1 and 2. Moody's thinks it is unlikely the Commission would establish rates that are lower than the temporary rates set by the new legislation. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
And would you agree with me that Moody's and the other credit rating agencies as well are observing and paying attention to what happens with this proceeding before the Commission that we're at today, correct?
Oh, absolutely, and that is the reason why I've cited the possibility of you get a $2.2 billion asset in North Carolina, PSNC. I've cited a possible dividend elimination. I've cited options for the company, and I think that they're quite clear that Moody's and other rating agencies are going to recognize that we're talking $445 million here to the consumer, but at the same time, we're talking about maybe $3 million a year in higher capital cost. And I believe that Moody's is quite well aware that the higher capital costs are, quite frankly, very, very tiny in regard to $445 million. I think they take all of that into account, and they know what's on the assets of Scanner right now, and one of those assets is PSNC.
Well, I appreciate very much that answer, Mr. O'Donnell, but it was not the answer to the question that I asked you. So let me try again. Do the credit rating agencies are watching and observing what happens in this proceeding, correct?
Correct.
And do you understand that currently for SC&G, Fitch has SC&G ranked or has a credit rating where it's speculative grade, below investment grade currently, correct?
I've heard that, yes.
Let me show you. Pull up Ms. Lapson's chart from her testimony. And have you checked the current ratings all the way on the right? Can you call those, can you highlight those, Laura Lee? All the way on the right, the ones that's in yellow. The current ratings, Fitch is BB+, which is below investment grade, correct?
Yes.
And then S&P is BB- with watch negative, and that's just one notch above speculative grade, correct?
Yes, it's BBB-, but yes.
Correct, BBB-. I'm sorry if I misspoke. And then Moody's has Baa3 with outlook negative as well, correct?
Correct.
And so that is just one notch above speculative grade for S&P as well, correct?
Correct.
And all of them have a watch on the stock or on the credit ratings. And as you pointed out in Moody's, the quote that you made, Moody's is observing and Moody's is predicting that the Commission would not take any action that would be less than making the experimental rate permanent. Is that correct?
That's what Moody's has said in that particular report. But again, Moody's is speculating what may occur. That is not the gospel. Still, I'll go back to the fact of how did we get to where we are? And what is the cost to consumers? $445 million versus the higher cost of capital of $3 million a year. Moody's has no control over what this commission may do. They're speculating.
Well, speculating may not be the quite word. They're observing and trying to make a determination, because at the end of the day, when they make a credit rating, the investment community observes that and takes notice of it, do they not?
Oh, absolutely. And I'm very confident Moody's is aware that there's a $2.2 billion asset owned by SCANA in North Carolina. I'm certain they're very well aware of that.
Yeah. And I'm sure you're going to make that same comment, Mr. O'Donnell. I'm trying to ask questions that will keep you from not having to make that comment. I think we all know that PNC is in North Carolina, and you've said that more than once. And but if you feel compelled to say it again, I'll leave that up to you.
Well, they're my gas utility. I mean, they serve my house, so I'm favored to PSNC.
Well, I'm glad, and I trust you pay your bill in a timely manner.
Every month.
Perfect. You're a great customer, and we appreciate you being a customer. Now, let me ask this of you. If the commission does not approve the merger and approves rates lower than the experimental rate, do you agree with me that these credit rating agencies are most likely to further downgrade SC&G's credit metrics?
No, because there are options available to the company where it can handle that. And also the last statement from Moody's said that it confirmed the ratings and said it was a manageable impact. So I can't agree with that because Moody's says it's manageable, and we have these other two options, one of which I won't mention anymore. But you can't necessarily make that jump like you're indicating that could happen.
Yeah. Well, now, I think you've talked about one of those options being further lowering the dividend. Was that one of the options you mentioned?
Eliminating the dividend, yes.
And I think you mentioned that on page, if I could get you to turn to page 9 of your testimony and look at line 26. And you say, yes, SCANA has cut its dividend. Now, this was back based upon the cut that was made in the summer. SCANA has cut its dividend but has not eliminated the dividend. I'm not recommending that SCANA take that action, but again, that option is available to the company. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
And would you agree with me as well that SCANA's dividend yield currently is 1.24%, correct?
Yes, I'm aware of that.
And would you agree with me that that's not a sustainable yield for a company that seeks investment, equity investments in the utility sector?
No, I will not agree with that at all. The entire purpose, the underlying purpose of a discounted cash flow model, the DCF model, is to put a dividend yield with a growth rate. And if there are some utilities that I'm aware of, I think they're primarily gas utilities that have very low dividend yields for one reason or another, but they also have pretty substantial growth rates. So when you put that dividend yield together with a growth rate, you've got a pretty good return. So no, I mean, just because it has a 1.24% dividend yield does not mean what you had indicated there. It is going to be, the market determines what the total return is going to be on the company. And if the market bids down the stock such that the dividend yield goes from 1.2% up to 3.5% or 4%, well, that's market driven. We cannot, in a regulatory body like this, say we have to have a 1.24% dividend yield. Then we're taking the place of what the stock market is doing, and we cannot do that.
Well, I recognize what you've said, Mr. O'Donnell, but let me ask it this way. Comparing a gas utility with a high growth rate would not be the same as would not be comparable to electric utility with a much lesser growth rate, would it?
Oh, I know. I think you have holding companies, and you'll remember from past testimonies that you and I have discussed when past rate cases. When you're looking at SC, E, and G, you have to look at the parent holding company, SCANA, and obviously they have both gas and electric assets. So you definitely look at the combination companies like that. And also the entire Hope and Bluefield case is centered all around comparability. Yes, you can definitely look at a gas utility like that, but it goes beyond gas utilities. I'm talking about the DCF is not germane only to the utility industry. No, I mean, people use the DCF model in assessing the value of corporate stocks day in and day out. I mean, I've been in this business for 33 years, but I mean, before that, I couldn't even, I was raised in the investment industry, so to speak. My family does that kind of work, and it's what we use, not only utility stocks, but it's what we use to measure just about any company out there. You just put a dividend yield with a growth rate, and then you have a cost of equity.
And would you agree with me that if you took a 1.24%, well, strike that. Let me ask another question of you, Mr. O'Donnell. If I could get you to take a look at your exhibit, I think this is on page 12 of your testimony.
Yes, sir.
You've got a table 1 there, is that right?
Yes.
And so I've got it up on the board as well. And I think what you did there is something you've acknowledged. You've acknowledged that SCNG will be faced with a higher cost of debt, and you also indicated it'd be faced with a higher cost for equity, but you didn't estimate the higher cost for equity, but you did try to estimate the higher cost for debt, did you not?
Yes, going forward on the various investments that the company may make, yes.
Correct. And I think this table is kind of summarizing your exhibit KW01, correct?
Correct.
And so what you used was an estimate of 16.67 basis points, and this is essentially an upcharge. In other words, you were estimating that the company might have to pay on the investments that you were looking at on your Exhibit 1 as much as 16.67 basis points above what it would otherwise have to make given its current impaired financial condition, correct?
Yes, but again, I don't mean to belabor this point, but it's ultimately customers who are going to be paying this because those bonds were downgraded through no fault of what customers have done, and so these numbers here represent, under a regulated system, what customers would ultimately pay in higher interest costs.
Correct, and certainly customers ultimately pay the cost and the expenses of an operating utility, do they not?
That's absolutely correct, but again, the purpose of that table was, and you can see in the paragraph right below it that's not on the screen there, was we're looking at rate cuts of $445 million annually, and any way you cut it, those numbers in that table are small in comparison. That was the point that I was trying to make with that particular table.
Well, then I appreciate you making that point. But let's look at these numbers here. Do you remember, did you read Ms. Griffin's testimony? She's the CFO of SCNG.
I think I did read it. I did read it, yes.
And did you observe that she had placed back in August of 2018 several hundreds of millions of dollars in 3-year bonds and 10-year bonds? Do you remember that?
I remember, yes.
And I think she did a chart in which she looked at the cost of those 10-year bonds compared to what other companies were paying that were ranked investment grade. Do you recall that?
Yes, vaguely.
And she indicated that the higher spread that they had to pay compared to, I think, 4 or 5 other companies that were making 10-year investments at the same time or issuing 10-year bonds at the same time was 63 basis points. Do you recall that?
I did recall that, but I have a problem with that kind of analysis because that's a snapshot in time, whereas what I did was I went back over a period of 8 years and looked at what that spread would be. I mean, you can always pull up a particular point in time, and the yield spread would vary, particularly when you're only looking at 5 securities like you just noted. That's the reason why I went back as far as I could and used a much bigger sampling base in the merchant bond record.
Certainly you did, but you at the time, looking back over 8 years, SC&G's credit metrics has changed substantially from what they were 8 years ago. Would you agree with that?
Yes, but the analysis I did had nothing whatsoever to do with SC&G over the past 8 years. I was looking only at the yield spread between a set of bonds in between, I think it was A and triple B.
And were you looking
that spread over that entire span?
And were you looking at just utilities, or were you looking at other companies in other industries as well? Or do you recall?
No, it was public utility. The difference was merchant bond record. I've got it cited on page 11 of my testimony. Public utility A-rated bonds and public utility BAA bonds.
But let me ask this, obvious. So you were all of those bonds for investment grade utilities?
Yes. If they were of that magnitude, yes.
But if Ms. Griffin is correct, and if the upcharge as a result of this summer is as much as 63 basis points rather than your estimated 6.67 basis points, that would mean that they're actually, SC&G was actually paying 3.78 times the charge that you, or the basis points that you have here. The difference between 63 basis points and 16.7 basis points, correct?
The math would work out, but all I'd do is point you to, you take that 100 and, or say that 12 million over 10 years, multiply it by your number, say roughly, 4, you get roughly 45 million. We're talking about $445 million in revenue requirements here. So whether you want to use 63 or whether you want to use 16.67, the difference is still very stark in terms of the revenue requirement.
Sure, and if you took that same factor, that the 12 would go to 45, and the 47 would go to 178 million, and the 110 would go to like 416 million, correct?
Over the 10 years, the 20 years, and the 30 years. So these are cumulative numbers I've got on that table right there, and as you just pointed out, you used that multiplier of 3.78, but that's going to be spread out over 30 years as compared to the 445 million, which is per year.
Correct. And so let me ask one other question. I want to get you to, you would also agree that if the credit ratings agencies should further impair the ratings of SC&G following this hearing and any decision that might be made, the risk that investors would perceive would be greater, and the cost of financing the business would also go up, would it not?
Well, again, I don't think that's going to happen. I've been very clear about that. But if there is any type of credit diminution, then yeah, I mean, you may end up paying a little bit higher in interest cost, but as a customer, $445 million sticks out there.
I understand. And it's all about revenue flow, money coming into the company, and the only way the company has of earning revenue is through the rates that it charges to its customers, correct?
Well, earnings, yeah, you put, well, I'm going to take that back. I mean, no, you can, You can sell in the wholesale market where it's competitive, and you can drive your earnings through a competitive market like that. You can also go outside of the electric utility industry and choose to do something else. And of course, you got the asset we won't mention anymore, as well as the dividends. So you've got options available so that you don't necessarily need to be too terribly concerned about a credit downgrade, because I don't think it's going to happen when you have these tools available to you.
So, and I appreciate that, Mr. O'Donnell, but let me get you to take another look at your Exhibit 1. If we can pull his Exhibit 1 up, please.
The KW1?
It is KW1. And I've got it on the board here. And essentially what you did, Mr. O'Donnell, is estimate the amount of capital, and you estimated it based upon the amount of debt capital that you thought the company might be required to invest to improve its system over time, correct?
Correct.
And you looked at generation and transmission and distribution as two sources of investment, correct?
Correct.
And you've got your total there. As we look down this chart, would it be roughly correct that you estimated that over that 30-year period of time that it would be about $150 million a year, more or less? And not 150 million.
Sorry, 150 million for what?
For investments and upgrades to the company system.
So you're talking about the total, column 4. That looks about right.
So did you hear Mr. Addison indicate that the company needed to invest somewhere on the order of $500 million a year in order to improve system, upgrade system, and meet the demands of the customers? Would that surprise you?
No, because he may have something in mind that's over and above what I'm seeing in T&D investments. I mean, the latest buzzword in the utility industry is something called grid mod, and it's quite frankly how utilities plan on driving earnings going forward. So if Mr. Addison is looking at spending $500 million a year for grid mod efforts, well, that may explain the difference between that and what I've seen here, because the T&D numbers in the first column I took those from the SNL.com, and then I obviously grew those numbers over time. So to the extent that the company is going to do something like grid mod, then it would not be reflected in those numbers.
Perfect. But my point is, if the amount of investment that the company would make is on the order of $500 million, and it would be acquiring those funds to invest in the system either through a combination of debt or equity, then the number that we would use to grow your estimate would have to increase by about another factor of about 3.5, correct?
I'm not going to debate your math, but when you stop and think about what you just said, you're talking about a $500 million investment every year. You're talking about some massive rate shock to consumers. And you're going to have to come back in to this commission and to tell them, we're going to increase your rates, whatever that amount is, 5%, 10% a year, whatever it is. If you're going to spend $500 million, at what point are you going to quit? At what point is your grid mod going to be done? And as I sit here and I think about this company spending that kind of money over 30 years, that's frightening to me from a consumer standpoint, because you're going to see some massive rate increases if you go forward with that kind of plan.
Well, regardless of the plan, and of course the company will do what it needs to do in order to try to improve and modernize the system as the demands for the system would require. The point is, if they have to raise that kind of capital with an impaired capital credit metrics, the cost of raising the capital will be more expensive, correct?
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
If the company has to raise capital, whether it's $1 or $500 million, the cost of raising that capital will be more expensive, correct?
I think it already has been more expensive through the downgrade that's occurred this year, and you're assuming that there may be another credit impairment, which I'm not willing to accept. But what this table shows is this is what consumers are already going to be asked to pay in higher interest costs because of what's already happened through no fault of their own. That's the point that I'm trying to make, but I can't necessarily predict what's going to happen in terms of forecasting what the company may spend or what their credit rating may go to.
Correct, but the numbers that you and I just talked about on the difference between 16.67 basis points and 63 basis points, if you multiply that set of numbers, the 45, the 177, the 416, by an additional factor of 3 based upon investments of approaching $500 million, then your calculations would grow to $150 million, to $500 million, to $1.2 billion, would they not?
I can't debate the assumptions you put in there. I don't agree with. If that's numbers that the company wants to put forward, I don't know why it didn't have a witness that could put those numbers forward. But those are assumptions that I can't agree with. But I will say this: the $1.2 billion number you just cited there, that's about 2.5 years worth of revenue requirements that we're talking about to customers. So again, that $445 million revenue requirement dwarfs anything that we've talked about here today in terms of what may occur with interest rates going forward. And like I said, I'm not willing to accept your hypotheticals.
I understand. Thank you very much, Mr. O'Donnell. Those are all of my questions.
Thank you.
No questions.
Sir. Okay, commissioners. Commissioner Whitfield.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Mr. O'Donnell. Good to have you with us here again.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
And obviously, you've been with us before, and obviously you're a valued witness of Mr. Elliott, and I certainly recognize that your class of ratepayers indirectly provides two sources of revenue for the company, both as a direct customer and the jobs that you provide for residential ratepayers as well, and the other taxes that are paid through that service as well. So that's fair to say. We certainly recognize your class of ratepayer, and it's important that I understand your testimony, and I don't want to summarize your summary, but basically what I'm getting, and you've repeatedly said it, I believe, is that the cost of debt that you acknowledge because of the credit downgrade is just not even a blip on the radar compared to the revenue requirement we're discussing here. Is that pretty much your testimony?
Yes, sir. But the other part of that is the debt downgrading has already occurred. These are costs that customers are already going to bear going forward.
Correct.
Right. So yes, in summary, that's correct.
And of course, you talk about some options the company has. Of course, you mentioned cutting the dividend, and then you talk about the other biggest option that we don't need to kick too much further down the can too much further down the road on this, but you talk about the sale of PSNC in North Carolina. Is it your testimony that you've set off and the company ought to examine that? Is it your testimony that the company just ought to stand alone and sell PSNC and that they could not do the merger and just therefore avoid bankruptcy and keep on keeping on? Is that what you're recommending as it pertains to the merger?
They have resources, yes, sir. I mean, let me put it to a corollary like this. If you're in a house and your family's in a house, and that house would be SCE&G, and the bank comes knocking on your door and says, you haven't made a payment in a few months, and you got to keep a roof over your family's head. But you've got this nice car sitting out in the garage. What are you going to do? You're going to sell that car, and you're going to keep that roof over your head. And SCE&G is the company's primary asset, and they're going to do what they need to do to protect it. And I'm not going to sit here and tell them that this is what they should do. That's a corporate decision that they have to make. But they also have the option of cutting their dividend, eliminating their dividend, and I'm certain they could probably find some internal cuts to make as well. But the point of the matter is they have options. And I know that they're looking at them because of the news article I found about PSNC.
And that's come out in testimony here as well. Let's go down that just for a second. What, in your opinion, what effect, if any, would a sale of PSNC have on SCANA's gas operations in other states?
It's a standalone, PSNC is a standalone utility. I don't think it's going to have much of an effect at all. But all the operations people that I'm aware of PSNC are based in Gastonia, North Carolina. They present their filings. I've done a couple of their rate cases in the past as a standalone utility in North Carolina.
So in your opinion, there wouldn't be any effect on Georgia, South Carolina, any other states that SCANA has gas operations?
I don't think it will, no, sir.
All right. Thank you, sir. That's all I have, Mr. Chairman.
Commissioners, other questions? Commissioner Hamilton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McDonald, happy to have you back, sir.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
I wonder if you would just take a minute and expand on the advantages in the dockets before us today on the favored nation clause.
Okay. The favored nations clause in this particular case would be that if as part of the merger that between or acquisition of SCANA by Dominion Resources in North Carolina, if they were to get anything, for example, a 5% rate cut, just throw it out there, whatever that number is, 5% rate cut for all customers. South Carolina customers would get the same thing. I'm not certain how that would flow relative to electric, whether or not a 5% gas rate cut would flow to a 5% electric rate cut, but it could definitely flow to the gas side. 5% gas cut, 5% gas cut. You give in one state, you give the same in another state.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you. Other questions? Commissioner Irvin.
Thank you for being with us this afternoon.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
What's your view of SC&G's potential for growth? We know the dividend's been cut and could be cut further under your scenario. How do you see their potential for growth?
The South Carolina economy, from what I've seen, is strong. And I just heard some scary numbers a moment ago about $500 million investment per year. So I think they would be a utility that folks are going to look at in terms of good long-term growth. I mean, we know that the coast of South Carolina is growing very strongly. The Greenville-Spartanburg area is doing quite well. So I would think that it's going to have some pretty strong long-term growth rates because the overall economy is pretty strong. And then, of course, if they do go forward with any type of grid mod efforts, I guess we'll have to deal with that in another docket.
But if they were successful in getting a grid modification cost approved, that of course goes into the rate base. They become more valuable.
they would have perhaps higher earnings value, but the concern I have with the grid mod efforts is that when you have CEOs of utilities that go before analysts and say this is how we're driving earnings, and they don't talk about how we're going to necessarily better the consumer, but we're going to drive earnings this way, you have to take a good hard look at why they're doing it. And obviously when load growth is flat, utilities have to find a different way to grow earnings. And I don't want to be like I'm unsympathetic to executives of utilities because, you know, they have Wall Street analysts bearing down on them. I get it. They need to grow earnings. But there has to be a middle ground somewhere in there. And to go out and to do all these grid mod efforts, particularly when you think about the grid mod efforts, what I think is being kind of glossed over is we're talking about high technology assets here. We're talking about telemetry. We're talking about self-healing grid. We're talking about electric assets that have to be out in the elements 24/7, 365 days a year. We're not talking about steel and concrete that can last for 30 years. So when you go down the road of some of these grid mod efforts, I'm very concerned that this may be the gift that keeps on giving, because you're going to have to replace some of these assets as early as 10 years. As an example, I have 4 towns in eastern North Carolina that left Duke Energy and they went with an emergent power supplier, and we're in the process of completing our telemetry upgrades now, and I was just out at one of the metering points last week and hooking up a Wi-Fi system and making certain that someone could call in remotely. That asset is very technical. It's not going to be there 30 years. I can promise you that it's not going to be there for 30 years, at least that particular piece of telemetry.
And so with securitization, it's not something you've been asked to talk about, but would that be another way that the company could seek some relief from the situation they're in?
Commissioner, I've been a little bit confused about securitization because you're right, it's not part of my testimony, but I am wondering who would be ultimately responsible for the debt. Would that be the state of South Carolina or would that be the utility? It sounds to me like it's going to be the state of South Carolina. And I don't know that's something that the state of South Carolina wants to take on, because that's a liability that goes in your books. And it's going to be shared by everybody, Duke customers, Santee customers, everybody. But I don't know as much about the securitization aspect as others have.
You mentioned there might be other suitors out there that would be interested in. Why do you think they haven't come forward?
I don't know that they haven't. I mean, Mr. Addison would know that. I don't. I mean, he may be having talks this afternoon with somebody else. I don't know. I'm just speculating that we're sitting here in the southeast and SCE&G is right up against Duke. I mean, you go 20 miles that way and you've got Duke service territory. So they may very well be waiting in the wings. They may be waiting for all the dust to settle here, and then they'll come in and pay a lower price. I don't know what's going to happen.
Thanks, sir.
Commissioners, other questions? Commissioner Elam.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Looking at page 8 of your direct testimony, and you're discussing the PSNC, and the quote that says that SCANA had turned down $2.2 billion, and you said you respect Mr. Addison's belief about the value, but do you have an opinion as to whether that was an adequate valuation for PSNC, $2.2 billion?
Well, my analysis, I did not do a analysis to determine the value of PSNC. And typically, if you look at what Piedmont was sold to Duke for, it was 3.5 market-to-book ratio. And I think AGL Services was sold to Southern Company at about the same ratio, about a 3.5 market-to-book ratio. I don't know what the PSNC number would pan out to be in that respect. My point is simply that you've got an asset up there. It's worth something. You've got a problem over here with another utility. You've got an avenue that an option you can use. Maybe that option's still on the table. I don't know. But with all respect to Mr. Addison, I understand he's got a fiduciary duty to stockholders. I get it. But this body and witnesses like me, we have duties to consumers as well. And so I think we need to somehow find that middle ground. And if the company needs to sell PSNC $2.2 billion to help get itself out of the nuclear problems that it finds, I think they ought to go ahead and look strong and hard at that.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Howard.
Good afternoon, Mr. O'Donnell. How you doing?
I'm doing good. How about yourself?
Fine. I expressed my concern the other day, and I guess it's still on the table, but I'm concerned about if SC&G goes alone, they would have access to the financial market to keep up with grid modernization, other things, to include, would the energy users be in jeopardy of not having reliable electricity, cut back on vegetation management, that type of stuff, and just access to capital and access to the market? I mean, do you see that as a problem?
No, I don't. I think that they have tools available to them to mitigate that problem. And in fact, Moody's said in their most recent credit report that their problems right now are manageable. So I don't see that problem going forward.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. O'Donnell, I want to ask you about something you stated in your summary testimony. Second page, essentially, you state your position that you do not believe that ORS's position is authorized by law. Is that your testimony today?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And I think it's also your testimony that ratepayers should not be required to pay any of the nuclear abandonment costs as requested by the company to bail out SCANA executives. Is that your testimony?
Yes, sir.
So that would be any and all costs related to new nuclear development?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So let's just say hypothetically the commission made that decision. What would be the impact to SCE&G if we made a decision to refund any and all nuclear development costs?
Well, obviously the stock would take a hit. How much, I don't know. But the point that I was trying to make there is we've got two parties that are being represented in this room, basically, and that is we got the stockholders on one side and we have ratepayers on the other side. Ratepayers didn't have anything to do with what's happened out at Summer. Stockholders invested into SCANA knowing full well what may happen. They voted in the board of directors who put Mr. Marsh and Mr. Addison in place. So stockholders have to take responsibility for what happened. If the stock does get hit, well, that's part of the world that we live in with stock investing. It's risk and it's return. The people who invested in companies, GE as an example of late, there's not a regulatory body for General Electric to go to. Their stock just got cut pretty hard.
And so, and I understand where you're coming from, but considering the fact that the Baseload Review Act allowed SCE&G to proceed down this path, do you not think there should be some consideration given to whether there were any prudent costs involved in going down this road at all? Isn't it a bit draconian to say that all costs should be refunded?
No, because the way that I've read the Baseload Review Act, and I cite the components of it in my testimony, I think it's in my rebuttal testimony, plan has to be being constructed, or it has to be constructed, be complete. And that's number one. And then number two, they needed to file an abandonment case before abandoning, and they did the exact opposite. They abandoned, then they filed the abandonment case. So I don't think it's draconian. I think it's this is what the law states, and it's a risk that investors took when they bought SCANA stock.
Okay. Let's talk about an exhibit that was entered into the record. I'm referencing Exhibit 53. It is a letter from Speaker of the House, James Lucas. It is addressed to Ms. Nanette Edwards, Executive Director of Office of Regulatory Staff. Are you familiar with that letter?
No, I'm sorry, I'm not.
We don't have it. Can someone show him a copy of this letter? You can take your time and just glance over that.
All right. Okay.
What are your thoughts on that letter? Well, let me ask you this, sir. First, do you know who Mr. Lucas is?
Speaker of the South Carolina House of Representatives.
What do you think about that letter?
I respectfully disagree. I believe that what the company has, I believe the company erred. I think that they violated the Baseload Review Act. And I know that they're before us, and I know that Ms. Lapson put testimony in and said that the company will be financially devastated. I don't agree. So, with due respect to Mr. Lucas, I believe that the company can absorb what we're talking about here. The nuclear costs are equivalent to the valuation of that utility in North Carolina.
And I respect your opinion, sir, and I appreciate you sharing it with us. We've heard a lot of opinions during the course of this proceeding, and sometimes they can come across as the commission can make a decision in a vacuum without unintended consequences for whatever decision that we may make. And I've made a personal point of trying to flesh out the unintended consequences, if you will, of the multiple decisions that are before us. And I just want to make sure that I understand you correctly in that you disagree with ORS's position, right? And you also disagree with the Speaker of the House's position.
Yes.
Okay. And your solution for this mess that we find ourselves in is for the commission to claw back any and all costs associated with the new nuclear development.
Yes.
And finally, your position is that if we were to make that decision, SCENG would survive.
Yes, because they have tools available to it. It still has operating expenses that it may be able to cut. It's got the elimination of the dividend, and it has that asset that we've talked about previously.
Thank you, sir.
Commissioners, other questions?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir.
One more question.
Yes, sir, Commissioner.
You mentioned clawback. We heard that phrase earlier. Is there any mechanism whereby the commission could claw back what we may perceive and find as imprudent bonuses to the executives that made these decisions that put us in this situation?
I don't know that, well, I don't know that you can necessarily take money from the executives who made this decision and get that money back. But what you could do is put a service penalty on the utility as well. And I've seen that in past cases. Quite frankly, I haven't seen one in several years, but I have heard of items like a 25 basis point reduction in the cost of equity for various reasons.
And how would that calculation be made?
Well, if you determine, for example, that the return on equity you're going to grant in this case is 9.5%, then you put a basis penalty of 9.25%, 25 basis points. So you set rates based upon lower return on equity than you would without the service penalty.
Thank you.
Other questions? Mr. O'Donnell, I was thinking as you were talking about grid mod and what we needed, what was that as being a way to drive earnings. One of the things we keep, that we've heard a lot in everything we do is the biggest threat to reliability is being cybersecurity. So grid modernization is probably one of the reasons that keeps getting put out there for the ability to fight that. How do we balance that need to modernize the grid to prevent cyber attacks and preserve the reliability of our grid with as a way to drive income or earnings?
Well, you're exactly right. I mean, I don't want to leave here today and have y'all think that I'm just totally against grid mod. I'm not. I mean, I understand certain things have to be done to the grid to make it stand up against cyber attacks. I get that, and I'm supportive of those efforts. But the price tags that we are seeing are astronomical, and they're very frightening. I testified in North Carolina recently where the utility was looking at a 50% rate hike to pay for these grid efforts. So I think to answer your question is we have to parse this with technical help, with folks who are really in tune to this, a couple of IT folks, or electrical engineers, folks like that who really understand the grid and understand what needs to be done to protect against cyber. And then we can agree to go ahead with some of those projects, but we just can't go forward blanketly saying we're going to accept all of them because consumers can't afford that. I know that my manufacturing clients, we can't afford some of the rate hikes that we're seeing out there, 30% rate hikes and so forth. We can't do that. We just won't be around. So I guess what I'm trying to say is we need to roll up our sleeves and really get at it a little bit more in terms of grid mod efforts.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Mr. Elliott, any redirect? I knew you couldn't turn down that microphone.
I could not. I've been storing up my questions, Mr. Chairman.
Remember about that space-time continuum,
Just several areas coming from commissioner questions. There was a commissioner question about you were aware of any other prospective purchasers for SCANA. Do you recall that?
Yes.
I would like to ask you, based on your experience, would you expect that the current contract between SCANA and Dominion might include a prohibition of SCANA negotiating with other potential suitors until this matter is resolved?
Absolutely. You're right. I mean, you often see those clauses where you're not allowed to talk to somebody else, and if you do make a deal with someone else, it's going to cost you up to hundreds of millions of dollars. So there may be something in that agreement.
All right, sir. And then understanding there's a great deal in this record already, but are you aware that the ORS testimony and evidence in the matter reflects that SC&G's rate base is currently $5 billion?
Yes.
And something that Mr. Willoughby asked you that just really completely slipped me was this idea that SCE&G now was going to spend another $500 million a year. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
All right. And so what that would suggest is, if that were true, that SCE&G intends to double its rate base in the next 10 years. Is that your understanding?
Yes, and that's why I responded. That's a scary proposition from a ratepayer's perspective.
And you're aware that the evidence in this record is that the total cost that SCE&G is hoping to get the ratepayers to pay for these two failed nuclear plants is slightly under $5 billion.
Right. Yes, sir.
Now, last, there was a question about customer growth. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And I would like to end my redirect on that note, and that is, in your view, what would the impact on on the SCE&G economy be from a permanent 18% reduction in rates?
Well, it's definitely going to help. From a manufacturing perspective, it's definitely going to help keep the manufacturers here, and it could very well attract more manufacturers to the state. I mean, South Carolina has always been known as a manufacturing-friendly state, so I'm optimistic that that would bring in some more manufacturers.
Well, and just given your experience, Walmart is a party in this matter. What would an 18% rate cut do for commercial customers?
Oh, they could expand stores. They could. When they expand stores, they're going to increase employment. 18% is a lot of money. It's tremendous injection to the economic growth of the state.
And then last, I think you are aware, based on your experience and your analysis of SCE&G's customer base, that SCE&G's residential customer base has been providing most, if not all, the growth for the company in the last 10 years or so.
Yes,
correct?
I'm aware of that.
And so, in fact, South Carolina has become sort of a destination for retirees. You're aware of that?
Particularly the Charleston area, yes.
So what impact would an 18% permanent rate cut have on the desirability of South Carolina and the Charleston area as a retirement mecca?
It's definitely going to make it a little bit more attractive for folks, particularly snowbirds, to get out of the Northeast and come down south.
And all of that development, all that growth would make SC&G a more valuable company, wouldn't it?
Absolutely.
No further questions, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Any recross? Okay. All right, Mr. O'Donnell, thank you for being here today.
Thank you,
and
sir.
You are excused.
Thank you.
I just want to make clear, Mr. Butler or perhaps Ms. Wheat would check me on this. We put in the appendix, what I described as the appendix to Mr. O'Donnell's testimony, and to my mind that included KWO1, and it's important to Mr. Willoughby, and I'd like just to make sure that's in the record.
That had been my impression also, Mr. Elliott. I had looked at that specific issue, and it appeared to be appended to the Appendix A. So I had thought my own position was that was part of the exhibit.
Well, I feel better about my way of thinking, but I just wanted to make sure.
Sir,
Thank you.
And Mr. Chairman, I just want to make sure that it's not all that important to me.
Yeah.
You know, we could probably write a song about this.
Yeah. Well, I promise not to sing it, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much.
That concludes my...
Okay, thank you. All right. Okay, I tell you what, we're going to take a break, and while we do, when we come back, we'll be entertaining the next witness for SCE&G. We'll come back in about 10 minutes. Thank you.